Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We've got certainly a lot to talk about over the next couple of hours. And if you went to your Parler app, you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about. And that is the fact that what some people have called the purge has begun. Now, we can talk about why that is taking place. And in just a minute, we'll get into some of the justification on the part of Twitter, saying that instead of just temporarily suspending President Trump's account, they will permanently ban his accounts. They've also added to that Michael Flynn, Sidney Powell, and a number of others. Parler no longer is able to be used because the hosting server has been yanked. And by the way, Apple even yanked the app from its app store. And if nothing else, illustrate how, in some respects, people love to mock it. Before it was yanked, it was interesting that if you look down the list of the most frequently picked apps, number one on the list was Parler. As soon as they pulled it, then you had to, of course, had the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, put his up there, so it was number one. So there are some individuals that are just enjoying the kind of power that the digital world has given to them. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that as well. There are many other issues to talk about as well that we will be discussing. Next hour, Ryan Casey Waller will be with us. He's joined us before, as you may remember, an individual that actually joined our Millennial Roundtable, but as a lawyer, pastor, and licensed psychotherapist, has a new book out called Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. So I thought we'll just give an entire hour, if nothing else, just sort of break all of this up. And then we'll get back into the news, because Jim Denison will be with us from about 2:30 to 3. I guess he's from 2:30 to 3, near the end of the program, talking about some of the chaos that's taking place. But before that, we'll talk about some of these issues once again in terms of the purge that some people are talking about. And again, you might feel that it is completely justifiable that the president's account be pulled, and I'll explain why Twitter thinks that they are justified in doing that. You will find that maybe their arguments aren't that compelling, but if nothing else, the storming of the Capitol on Wednesday provided more than enough excuse now for what is going to be, I think, an ongoing attempt to significantly reduce the presence of anybody that people in Silicon Valley might dislike. That would be conservatives, that would be Republicans, that might be Christians. And that is illustrated by the fact that now there is a convincing argument that the administration is going to be very favorable towards social media, towards big tech, and that any possible threat that might have existed before to begin to rein in big tech is simply gone. And there's a very good argument that can be made for that, and that is the fact that the incoming president, Joe Biden, has received more money from Silicon Valley than any candidate in the history of this country. You might say, wait a minute, that's a pretty outlandish statement, so you better be able to back it up. Oh, I can back it up. Here it is. The money that comes from those individuals in the San Francisco Bay Area, Democrats, was, interestingly enough, 163 million back in 2016, now 199 million in terms of that. And then if you might say, well, yeah, but didn't they give to Trump? Yeah, there was all of 22 million that was given to Donald Trump. So if you want to look at the numbers, there are a number of individuals in Silicon Valley that are pleased that Donald Trump, and more importantly, Kamala Harris is the vice president, because she has always been very sympathetic to Silicon Valley. And now that they have not only the convincing argument that you have somebody in the Oval Office that will not challenge them, but also there isn't even anybody in the Senate that might challenge them because of those two elections last week in Georgia. So that's where we find ourselves right now. But let's go to our first article, which has actually been kind of modified, because since the decision not only to suspend the account and now permanently ban the account for Donald Trump, you also have this now being applied to a number of other individuals. Some of the more prominent ones would be Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. His has been banned, as so has the lawyer Sidney Powell. And as we mentioned on Friday, Sidney Powell has got her own problems, because the Dominion voting system has also decided that they have slapped a $1.3 billion defamation lawsuit against Sidney Powell. As Dr. Merrill Matthews points out, since he knows Sidney Powell a lot better than I do, that she does not have $1.3 billion. But what this is simply an attempt to do is, first of all, to cause her to no longer speak out. Number two, to send a warning signal to anybody else that you say anything negative about the Dominion voting systems, we're going to slap you with a lawsuit that you would never be able to recover from. And so in some respects, the argument that has come from Twitter is that we are going to take strong enforcement actions on behavior. And so they've applied that not only to their own account, which is Twitter, but now they have been encouraging some of their allies to actually also do what they can to remove Parler as the alternative to that. And that came out just the other day, where Apple, first of all, decided to actually remove Parler's app from their app store, which made it, of course, more difficult for people then if they wanted to log into Parler to do so. And so the argument from the App Store is, we've always supported diverse points of view, but there's no place on our platform for threats of violence and illegal activity. Parler has not taken adequate measures, they say, to address the proliferation of these threats to people's safety. And it brings us back to something we'll probably spend more time talking about with Jim Denison in the 2 o'clock hour. If you did not have the storming of the Capitol on Wednesday, some of this might have happened anyway, but this provided such a convenient excuse to now pull the app from that particular app store. And then you go on a little bit further, because then once the app store pulled it out, then almost immediately you had Jack Dorsey, who then, in order to sort of mock that, went down to the Apple Store now and pointed out that now, once they pulled the Parler app out, then the one at the top was the one that is an app that would put you that he has developed as well. And so these are individuals that seem to be enjoying the flex of their power. And it also illustrates something we've talked about before with certainly Rod Dreher, and that is this so-called soft totalitarianism. If you're keeping track here, almost everything I've just mentioned has not come from the government. It's all come from social media. It's not come from the, if you will, public sector. It's come from the private sector. And I think it illustrates maybe a preview of coming attractions. So nevertheless, that is the issue that we'll talk about. Once the purge begins, where does it stop? Well, Jarrett Stepman says, we really don't know. And if indeed they can remove the Twitter accounts of some very prominent people like Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell and President Trump, they can probably release and remove yours too if they so desire. And it illustrates a little bit more the kind of world that we find ourselves moving into. And Rod Dreher kind of gave us an advanced look on that when we talked with him the other day. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The many myths surrounding the slogan, defund the police, need to be addressed. That is why I was encouraged to read a thoughtful critique from a progressive who lives in Seattle, but also works for law enforcement. Christopher Young has been a big city cop for more than a quarter century and brings some common sense to the debate about the police. The first myth he tackles is the argument that police are killing large number of civilians. Criminal justice experts I've quoted in previous commentaries have proven that's not true. He cites statistics from New York City to prove his point, but you can also use national crime statistics as well. His second myth is the naive belief that the anti-cop movement is largely peaceful. He likens the movement to Batman's villain, Two-Face. The protests in the daytime were mostly examples of lawful free speech. The dynamic changed dramatically at night as riots broke out. He reminds us that the mainstream media adopted what he called the comically false peaceful protest narrative, which was obviously untrue. A third myth is that abolishing police wouldn't lead to lawlessness. As a police officer, he saw firsthand Seattle's experiment with a Capitol Hill autonomous zone known as CHAZ. Police weren't allowed in the occupied protest zone for weeks. They saw the lawlessness that broke out when police could not be on patrol. A final myth is that the police are militarized. As a former soldier, he knows what it was like to ride in an armored vehicle. Today, SWAT team members use armored vehicles and armored clothing in order to avoid using deadly force, not commit it. I agree with this police officer's conclusion that the defund the police arguments are either wildly exaggerated or just plain false. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just, if I can, give Twitter its due, because if nothing else, they are a private company, and we said that there would certainly be an opportunity to evaluate or reevaluate some of the freedoms that have been given to social media platforms, because they turned out not to be platforms and publishers. And again, if you're going to be a platform, then any person that wants to address the issues, as long as they're not calling for maybe criminal activity, you should provide that platform. But if you're going to prevent certain individuals from speaking, well, then you're more of a publisher, and you should not be protected by some of the things that were part of the Communications Decency Act. But that, if you will, horse has left the barn, that genie's out of the bottle, and there is little chance now that any reining in of social media will take place. The argument here, and it is an argument being made by Twitter, is that some of the tweets that have been sent out by the president are dangerous. And so let me just read the actual Twitter statement so you can hear what they had to say. After close review of recent tweets from @RealDonaldTrump account and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter, we have permanently suspended the account due to the risk of further incitement of violence. Okay, that's the argument. what are the justification? There are two tweets that they have talked about. One is fairly long, but I think you can catch it. That one came out the other day, and it said, the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first and make America great again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. That one was seen as violent, I guess. I'm still trying to even get into the leftist mind, even though I just did a booklet on the leftist mind, how that is violent, other than the fact that he refers to them at one point American patriots, and American patriots are now enough to say that these are violent individuals. So you can't use the word American patriots. And if you're saying, I've never heard you say that before, you weren't listening to the interview we did with the coddling of the American mind and some of those kinds of statements that we're saying, as soon as you use a word like patriot, well, that, of course, means dangerous individuals. And so that seems to be the best justification for why that one is dangerous. Of course, you tie that to what happened on Wednesday. That's probably enough for them to justify that. But the other tweet was even more intriguing, because they did list two tweets. And the second one was, to all who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Probably better anyway. He'd probably make more of a scene if he did. But the bottom line is that was perceived as suggesting then, because I'm not going to the inauguration, then it's a safe place for you to engage in violent activities or something. And I mean, after a while, you just have to say, have we lost all common sense? And of course, as I've said before, Twitter's free to do whatever Twitter wants to do, but you would think they would have used better arguments. Those certainly don't help us, because as Jarrett Stepman points out, some of the arguments being made about the risk of further incitement of violence, he says, rings rather hollow, given the fact that they allow, and here's his list, the Chinese Communist Party on Twitter, Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, who is a socialist, on there. The Ayatollah of Iran has a platform on Twitter. And so, and you can go through the list, but you get the idea. These are people that do pose a real danger to the United States of America, do pose a danger, and of course that is not even mentioned. But lest you think the purge only has to do with Silicon Valley, there's a couple of other things we might add to the list, and that also is in this article by Jarrett Stepman, in which the Lincoln Project, which are made of people that at one point had been Republicans but turned against Trump and all that, they're now constructing a database of people that have worked for Donald Trump. Those would be various officials, cabinet officers, staff, and others, so that they can track where they are now. And so as a result, to do what they can to make sure that if any of them apply for another job, you know, could be in a bank, could be with another political group, it could be in a think tank, that they will do what they can to criticize those individuals. And of course, that also is an illustration of what is taking place as well. And lest you think that it only stops there, Bronson Stocking talked about the fact that here you have this public school teacher who apparently attended the event. And again, I would make a distinction. Let's hope we can make a distinction between those who went to the rally on Wednesday and listened to the presidents and other people speak at the Ellipse, and those people who forced their way into the Capitol. As far as I can tell, though, this is a teacher who is a public school teacher in Allentown, Pennsylvania, who has been relieved of duty pending a formal investigation. And the statement that comes from the superintendent is, because of the emotion and controversy stirred by the events of January 6th, the teacher has been temporarily relieved of his teaching duties until the school district can complete a formal investigation into his involvement. They went on to then say, yesterday's events have added to the confusion and uncertainty our students are experiencing during this unprecedented time. To this end, we are reminding our staff to think carefully about what they share online, how it would affect their students and fellow community members. While we all have a right to express ourselves, it is important to do so respectively. We ask the same of students and families. And the particular statement was posted both in English and in Spanish. And I'm just giving you one example because I've found now a number of other individuals who, just by attending the rally itself, were enough to actually lose their job or to have them, in one case, removed from the legislature and a variety of others. So are there any recourse? Well, one suggestion has come from the ranking member in the House Intelligence Committee, and that would be Devin Nunes, who is a Republican from California, who called for a RICO investigation. Okay, what's RICO? Well, it stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corruption or Corrupt Organizations Investigation in Big Tech, because of the stifling, in this particular case, not of those who are on Twitter, but the attempt to actually drive Parler into bankruptcy or to oblivion would be that. And so he said the effect of this is there is no longer a free and open social media company or site for any American to get on anymore, because these big companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, they've likely destroyed what was likely $1 billion company. And then he was also very critical of the Department of Justice and the FBI for being silent on the issue, saying what took place is clearly a violation of antitrust, civil rights, and a RICO statute. And so he said this the other day on Fox, and he said there should be a racketeering investigation on all of the people that coordinated this attack, on not only a company, but on all those like us. I have, he says, 3 million followers on Parler. At midnight tonight, he was pointing out yesterday, I will no longer be able to communicate with those people. And so, again, the shutting down of Parler, the beginning to shut down various accounts in Twitter, is just what has happened over the weekend. And we are still, 9 days out before we actually have the next president step into the Oval Office. And so in the meantime, I've ignored one issue, the impeachment. And it turns out that now James Clyburn, who is the House Majority Whip, has said, we're not going to try to push this as quickly as we might. There was an attempt today to have a singular article of impeachment that was pretty much defended off by a Republican because, if nothing else, you weren't under what's called regular order. But when they get together tomorrow, probably that or next day or two will happen. But the Majority Whip, I should say, James Clyburn, Democrat from Georgia, said that, they aren't going to try to push this. What they are instead going to do is that the House may not send articles of impeachment to the Senate until maybe after the first 100 days of Joe Biden's presidency. They don't want that to be a distraction from all the things Joe Biden might do. But it does raise an important question. You have 9 days between now and when you could even impeach the president. And yet we've had a couple of people point out that there is a rule that would require that even if you were to sign the articles of impeachment today without even going to a committee meeting, there would not be an ability for the Senate to hold a hearing until January 20th at 1 p.m., and that would be an hour after Donald Trump is no longer in office. So then Alan Dershowitz has also pointed out that this idea of later doing an impeachment of Donald Trump, well, that doesn't work either, because the Constitution says the power to impeach the president, not the power to impeach a previous president. But we'll see how this unfolds, and we've got a lot more to talk about right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Hey, once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. In about a half an hour, we're going to have Ryan Casey Waller with us. His book, Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About, I think is certainly very necessary. Even before we had the pandemic, the lockdown, the conflict, riots in the streets, and much, much more. So that is a conversation we're going to have with him. Then we're going to get into the conversation with Jim Denison and a biblical response to the chaos in Washington. A more recent one that just came out today was the Capitol riot, a Christian insurrection. So we'll have lots to talk about with him. Of course, we'll welcome your phone calls there as well. You know, when we talk about social media, people like to point out hypocrisy, but oftentimes people don't even care. The lack of shame about hypocrisy is kind of hard to deal with, but one of the pieces that came out from Roger Kimball is at a time when, of course, Twitter is, tut, you shouldn't be doing things that could be even perceived as maybe encouraging violence. He reminded us that at a time when Black Lives Matter rioters were, in the case of attacking cities, Colin Kaepernick actually at one point called for more violence. And in response to that, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, responded by making a $3 million contribution to one of Colin Kaepernick's charities. So that is the case. And it brings us to one of the other articles that I've posted here by Katie Pavlik, Why Hypocrisy on Violence Matters. Now, let's be clear. I don't care whether you have attacked the police and some response to any kind of what you perceive to be police brutality or racial injustice, or because you believe that the election was stolen, or you have followed the comments by Donald Trump, or you simply believe in QAnon. It really doesn't matter because, as I've said before, touch a police officer, you go to jail. Break in where you're not supposed to be, you go to jail. Break a window, you go to jail. Attack somebody, you go to jail. Vandalize any kind of area, whether it's a public monument or whether it is the Capitol or whether it's a business, you go to jail. So that is the case. But Katie Pavlich points out the fact that indeed most of the culprits that were the supporters of Donald Trump, willing to spill their blood for his cause, some were agitators looking for a fight, others came along for the ride. The footage from the scene is horrific. So she makes all the statements that of course you should make, and anytime anybody tries to explain that away, I think you are going to have real questions about that, because what we have seen was horrific. And so let's put that on the table. But then she points out that the former vice president, now President-elect Joe Biden, made this statement: the scenes of chaos in the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are. What we are seeing are a small number of extremists dedicated to lawlessness. This is not dissent, it is disorder, it's chaos, it borders on sedition, and it must end now. I call on this mob to pull back and allow the work of democracy to go forward. So that's what Joe Biden said in a televised statement. The work of the moment and the work of the next 4 years will be the restoration of democracy, of decency, honor, respect, rule of law, just plain, simple decency. The renewal of the politics that's about solving problems, looking out for one another, not stoking the fires of hate and chaos. As I've said, America is about honor, decency, respect, tolerance. That's who we are and who we've always been. I can read some quotes from some places where he referred to those individuals as Nazis, but okay, we'll take it as it is. But then that's where Katie reminds us that just last year, America's watched as cities around the country were ransacked by Antifa and Black Lives Matter rioters. People were killed. Government buildings came under siege. Let's recognize that the Capitol is a government building, but so are some of the other government buildings that were under siege, and thousands of buildings owned by hard-working Americans were burned to the ground. They were the most expensive riots in American history, and they lasted for months. When this was occurring, Katie wants to remind us, the left and Democrats not only refused to condemn it, they embraced it. She points out something that, again, the mainstream media just simply won't ask about. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris back then helped fundraise to get rioters out of jail. That's well documented. The rioters, she points out, attempted to storm the White House, burned historic church, injured more than 60 Secret Service agents in the process. And the D.C. mayor not only refused to punish the perpetrators, instead she dedicated an entire block to the movement and named it Black Lives Matter Plaza. Corporations donated billions of dollars to the cause. And so, again, she reminds us that Joe Biden failed to roundly condemn any of that until it started showing up as negative in polling. His friends in the media, like CNN's Chris Cuomo, she says, declared protesting wasn't supposed to be polite, as his network described rioters as fiery but mostly peaceful. They didn't call these ones last Wednesday mostly peaceful. And then, of course, she reminds us that for 4 years, Democrats incited violence against Trump supporters and those who worked for him. You might remember some of the comments by Maxine Waters told constituents to accost Trump supporters in public to run them out of society. You can remember how that did not end well for people like Ted Cruz in a restaurant, or how about Rand Paul, who was viciously attacked, and then I had broken ribs. I think he lost part of a lung or a liver or something. I can't remember exactly what. And of course, the shooting that took place on the ball field with Republican legislators and others. And of course, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez urged people to start making lists of administrative officials. Matter of fact, the other day, where's her comment here? She made the statement that it is really maybe time for the Senate to completely remove Ted Cruz and a variety of other individuals simply because they were standing up for should be expelled. The Senate should expel Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley from the Senate. So those are the kinds of comments being made right now. So at a time when, on the one hand, people are saying, we need to calm down the rhetoric, you're having other people raising the rhetoric to maybe a new level, and it is something that once again just illustrates why today my commentary is on the subject of defund the police. We have for, of course, months heard people talking about defund the police, and so I posted this particular one because it comes from a very good article that came out by Christopher Young. Now, it turns out that he describes himself as a progressive, and even in his short comments about the things he agrees with, you can see that he fits pretty well within the Seattle area. But even though he lives in Seattle, even though he would refer to himself as a progressive, and if he wants to decriminalize certain activities, he nevertheless also works in law enforcement. So I oftentimes think that probably the best person to articulate a view is a person who you might expect not to have held to that view. And so he talks about 4 different myths about defund the police. I read these the other day, but I thought I'd mention them again because if you want to print out my commentary, maybe pass it on or post it on your Facebook page, you can do so. The first myth he talks about is the argument that police are killing large numbers of civilians. Of course, a number of criminal justice experts that I've quoted, we even have a booklet on criminal justice, actually point out that that is not the case. He gives you some statistics and cites some statistics from New York City to prove his point, but you can look at the national crime statistics to know that's simply not true. It's been said so often, though, that I think most of the people out in the street believe that there's just a wholesale killing of large number of civilians, and that is really not the case. The second myth, he says, is that the anti-cop movement is largely peaceful. I love his illustration. He says it's a little bit like the Batman villain Two-Face, because he says, really, the protests in the daytime oftentimes were examples of lawful free speech. I don't completely agree with that, but I'll concede the point. But the point he was making is that the dynamic changed dramatically at night. And if you saw what has happened in Portland and Minneapolis and other places, that's indeed where you have that. And he takes on this, what he calls comically false, peaceful protest narrative of the mainstream media. Number 3, he says a third myth is the abolishing police won't lead to lawlessness, which is just naive and reminds us that he had firsthand experience with Seattle's experiment with the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, known as CHAZ. And when police weren't allowed in the occupied protest zone, lawlessness broke out like you would have imagined. And then a final one is that the police are militarized. And he points out, look, I was in law enforcement, but I was also in the military. And when we rode around in armored vehicles, that's because we were trying to kill bad guys. SWAT team now walk around with armored clothing and armored vehicles, not because they want to use deadly force, but they want to prevent from committing it. And a SWAT team member, he points out, wearing protection may be able to wait longer before using force because he or she is more protected. So anyway, it's an attempt to answer some of those myths about defund the police. It's on our website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll find it and print it out. Maybe even post it. When we come back, one other article, Repeal the Pardon Power. Somebody else is saying the same thing I've been saying for some time. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then, like I said, we will have Ryan Casey Waller with us. Top of the hour, we're going to be talking about depression, anxiety, and other things we don't want to talk about, but we will be talking about those here on Point of View. Then we'll get into some of the conversation of the chaos in Washington, D.C., and Jim Denison will be joining us, but we'll also look at some of the other issues that I've put on the table here as well. But just before we take a break, one of the other articles that I have cited is one on the fact that maybe it's time to repeal the pardon power. If you've listened to this program from the very beginning, even back in the first days I was doing this program, and that's more than 30 years ago, I've always had a little bit of unease about the idea that a president or a governor sometimes can pardon or add clemency to an individual who was actually convicted. And a lot of that goes back to all the way in which we actually came from a monarchy to a republic. And there were a few things that were sort of brought, and one of those is that we will allow the chief executive to have the opportunity to pardon somebody the way a king can do that. Now, to their credit, the framers decided not to allow people to bestow titles of nobility and things like that. So we got rid of that kind of monarchy part, but we unfortunately kept this part as well. And so an individual we've interviewed on this program before, Andrew MacArthur, says, it's maybe time to amend the Constitution. Let me give you the history and then just show you how this has just gotten completely out of hand. It was out of hand under Bill Clinton and probably should have been done then. I suspect it's going to be out of hand this next week because before he leaves office, Donald Trump can pardon all sorts of people. We'll even see whether or not people think he can pardon himself on all sorts of issues. And so I'm thinking of writing a commentary that'll come out the day after the inauguration. I've already written my commentaries for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week, but maybe for next Thursday I might talk about that because we may be reeling from some of the pardons that Donald Trump has provided. But believe me, he's not the first, and if we don't amend the Constitution, he certainly will not be the last. But Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist Paper number 74, talked about the fact that they gave the president the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. In other words, you couldn't pardon yourself on impeachment. So there we go back to this idea that if you can get an impeachment of the president in the next 9 days left? Maybe he couldn't pardon himself. And then it goes through the attempt to saying that sometimes this might help restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth. And so let's look at the history. President George Washington actually pardoned a pair of Whiskey Rebellion agitators who were actually sentenced to death for treason. And as a result, that was probably not what Alexander Hamilton actually anticipated, but that was the first pardon of any consequence all the way back to George Washington. Okay, let's fast forward. This has been used in ways to bring about healing. President Lincoln made a lot of use of the pardon because he actually provided clemency to dozens of Confederate soldiers and officials, and then in 1863 had kind of a broad amnesty as part of his vision for post-war reconstruction of the South. As you well know, he was assassinated, so that was not done. But nevertheless, the next president, who was the vice president at the time, Andrew Johnson, did issue a broad pardon to the Confederacy, which was, I think, so necessary after a civil war, and actually issued that one, kind of a footnote in history, on Christmas Day, 1868. Anyway, just a little bit of it. But let's now fast forward, because what you have now then are the controversies that have surfaced with the pardon. Probably one of the more visible ones during the 1970s was when the former vice president, incoming president Gerald Ford, pardoned his predecessor, Richard Nixon, in an effort to just kind of move the nation and the administration past Watergate. There's no doubt that the Democrats would have wanted to actually do what it could to prosecute Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford did that, and many people think that he would have won re-election over Jimmy Carter if he had not. But nevertheless, then you have Jimmy Carter, who replaced him, had a mass pardon of over 200,000 Vietnam draft dodgers, draft evaders, which was even more than, as he points out here, Harry Truman's pardoning of people in World War II who were conscientious objectors. Then let's go to the next president, President Reagan. Didn't do much on pardon, but he did pardon one or two individuals who were FBI officials who had broken into the anti-war activists' offices. One of those individuals is Mark Felt. He turned out to be, we found out later, Deep Throat of Watergate fame. But now we come to where it just got completely out of hand. Under President Bill Clinton, probably the one that people remember the most is the pardon of Mark Rich, who was a wealthy fugitive, a racketeer, but who had provided quite a number of very lucrative donations to the Clinton Library and the Clinton coffers. More than that, of course, he also pardoned a convicted terrorist of the Weather Underground, a Puerto Rican separatist group. He even gave a full pardon to Patty Hearst, the newspaper Harris that was involved in domestic terrorship. And so you have all of that controversy, and maybe is a time when maybe we should have reevaluated this. President Barack Obama, of course, did give commuted sentences to one of these terrorists, Chelsea Manning, the transgender Army intelligence officer who leaked classified information. And now, of course, Donald Trump has pardoned Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and George Papadopoulos. And, of course, you've had also pardons to Joe Arpaio, who was the sheriff of Maricopa County in Arizona. Dinesh D'Souza has been on the program with us, the filmmaker, even Charles Kushner, the father of Jared Kushner. And I kind of see, if you're nothing else, where this is going, because next week, maybe even later this week, President Donald Trump, now no longer worried about re-election one way or the other, might actually pardon all sorts of individuals. And the list is getting pretty long of people that he might actually pardon. We can only guess who those might be. By the way, I forgot to mention some of the others for Bill Clinton. I just happened to see this one here. One of those was Roger Clinton, his half-brother, for distributing cocaine and a variety of others. Of course, Clinton also pardoned Susan McDougal and, John Deutsch. I mean, the list really got pretty long. And if nothing else, I think illustrates only so well why maybe it is really time to repeal the pardon power. And if indeed what many of us suspect will happen over the next 9 days, in which some individuals that maybe shouldn't be pardoned will be pardoned by Donald Trump, maybe we can finally try to move through Congress a change, maybe an amendment, maybe some kind of statement from Congress or something about the fact that in the old days, sometimes the pardons helped provide a little bit of domestic tranquility. Maybe we're able to calm some of the tension between the North and the South in the Civil War. Maybe just leave the issue of conscientious objection behind or draft dodging behind. But it has certainly gotten out of hand over these last few years, and maybe a good reason to, as the article says, repeal the pardon power. Anyway, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our friend Ryan Casey Waller about anxiety, depression. He's a fellow traveler, and he can tell you some of the things he's experienced and really help you if you're dealing with this as well in your family or even individually. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about a very difficult topic, but one that we've addressed many times before, and that is the whole issue of depression and anxiety, and how that has, even as we've gone through the last year or so, made it even more difficult and even more important to talk about, because this is something that strikes perhaps you, certainly someone in your family, somebody in your sphere of influence. So we really want to equip you to be more effective to address some of those issues. And the title of the book we're going to be talking about is called Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. It is written by Ryan Casey Waller, who is a pastor, a therapist, a co-sufferer. As a matter of fact, you might say, that name sounds familiar. Yes, he's joined us on a number of occasions, kind of as a roundtable discussion, and an individual that last time we talked with him was kind of in the ministry, but he is a licensed psychotherapist, a lawyer, and a pastor. Yes, he's heard all the jokes about being both a lawyer and a priest. But if you got another one, you can certainly join in. Studied philosophy and religion at the University of Southern California. Also has a law degree, a master's degree in theology, a master's degree in counseling from Southern Methodist University. Yes, he's a very high achiever in many cases, but also a friend who's been around the table with us talking about other issues. But today we're also going to learn a little bit more about his own experience and how he's been sharing that with others. So, Ryan, always great to have you on the program with us.
Kerby, that was such a gracious introduction. Thank you so much. It's good to hear your voice. Good to be back with you.
You've been in the studio with us before. Maybe next time we'll get you in studio, but it does tell us that maybe even while we're chatting with you, interacting with you, you're making comments about the millennial generation or about trends in society. There's something going on in your life. And early on in your book, you talk about the fact that you were supposed to go to a meeting, and your wife, who's very sweet, was saying, you don't have to stay around here. The kids are good. It's all fine. You don't have to stay here for us. And yet, because the depression was so heavy on your heart and on your mind, you really didn't want to leave the house and go to this particular session that was something that you were using to reach out to those people in the legal profession dealing with depression. Tell us more, if you might.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The story that you tell is, one evening I was supposed to be heading to a recovery group that I go to for lawyers who battle depression. And just as you say, on that particular night, I simply didn't want to go. And often this is what depression does. I tell people that depression is a very, very intelligent disorder, in that it often convinces a person while they're in the midst of it to do the exact opposite of what would be the healthiest thing for them to do. So in my case, like for many people, when they're in the midst of depression, one of the primary things we can do that we know is curative in and of itself is to reach out and be in community and experience socialization. So just to be with other people. But oftentimes, when a person is depressed, what their brain will tell them to do is isolate. So it'll say, no, instead of reaching out and making yourself available to other people who can comfort you, who can hold space for you, who might be able to give you a hug or a word of encouragement or some actual wisdom, what you ought to do is go and be alone with yourself, which in turn, almost every single time is going to do nothing but exacerbate the depression. And so it's really, really tricky. I was once speaking with an addiction psychiatrist, somebody who really works with people who are deep in the throes of addiction, oftentimes in situations that are life and death. And he told me that even with those patients who are severely ill, if he can encourage them to find a meaningful community, so a place where they can know other people and a place where they can be known, he says half the battle is already won.
Wow.
And I remember when he told me that, I was shocked because I thought, here's a Johns Hopkins trained medical doctor telling me this guy's got all the resources in the world, but he is literally saying, if you can just get somebody to have a friend or friends, that is going to do half the job that we need in helping them on the road to recovery, which I find mind-blowing, but also as a Christian, it just reminds me, I'm like, well, wow, this is what we were told actually in Genesis from the very beginning, right? There's only one thing that God looks around in creation and says is not good, and that man's alone. We were designed to be with one another.
Yes. And again, that's where the church can provide an answer that sometimes you can't find elsewhere. The statistics, I'm not going to overdo it, but a few just to remind us why we talk about this. In any given year, 1 in 4 American adults will experience a mental health condition. You also point out that we have a dramatic shortage of psychiatrists and other counselors. Roughly 20 American veterans die by suicide every day, accounting 14% of all suicides, although they represent only 8% of the population. We've talked about this before with our wounded veterans, wounded not only necessarily physically, but also emotionally, and just the incredible cost globally of mental disorders. And back to your point about getting together, this is illustrative of the fact that because we've had a pandemic, because we've had a lockdown and all sorts of other things, a problem that you were writing about before this book came out just within the last couple of weeks has become even more significant, hasn't it?
Oh, it has. Isolation and loneliness, while not always predictors of poor mental health, we know that we do better when we're together. And so as a mental health professional, yes, ever since the pandemic has begun, it's been quite frustrating because a lot of the resources that we have typically, right, when we encourage people to go, to get involved in a community, to reach out to a church group, right, to find a new hobby, all these sorts of things, to go and gather with friends and family, you know, in many cases are things that are just not possible in certain situations, or they're not maybe the safest thing to do. It has been, to put it, you know, bluntly, a bit of a nightmare, because it's just made it very, very difficult. And the reality is, you know, human beings are resilient. And I talk about that in the book. And
yes.
How resilience, you know, we often think about resilience as being a character quality of exceptional individuals, like a Tom Brady, who, you know, still winning in the playoffs, right, at age 43, or somebody else who overcomes some significant obstacle. But the reality is humans are resilient in the sense that, by and large, when we face an obstacle or when we get knocked down, usually the overwhelming response is that we come back together, right? We lick our wounds, and then we look around and we say, okay, what can we do to get back? How can we rebuild this? How can we help one another? How is it that we can move forward? And we've seen this with the isolation and the ways that we've all adapted to try and connect with each other virtually. Churches have gotten really innovative in the ways that they're gathering, both either, you know, in person in safe ways or online. And so we do this, but the reality is there is nothing that can take the place of two humans occupying the same space and time and being with one another. I mean, the chemical oxytocin that gets released in our brain when we are with a loved one or someone we care for, that we get from a touch or a hug or an embrace, doesn't happen in the same way online. So it's made it really tough.
We're going to take a break. Depression, anxiety, and other things we don't want to talk about. Well, we're going to talk about them right here on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The many myths surrounding the slogan, defund the police, need to be addressed. That is why I was encouraged to read a thoughtful critique from a progressive who lives in Seattle, but also works for law enforcement. Christopher Young has been a big city cop for more than a quarter century and brings some common sense to the debate about the police. The first myth he tackles is the argument that police are killing large number of civilians. Criminal justice experts I've quoted in previous commentaries have proven that's not true. He cites statistics from New York City to prove his point, but you can also use national crime statistics as well. His second myth is the naive belief that the anti-cop movement is largely peaceful. He likens the movement to Batman's villain, Two-Face. The protests in the daytime were mostly examples of lawful free speech. The dynamic changed dramatically at night as riots broke out. He reminds us that the mainstream media adopted what he called the comically false peaceful protest narrative, which was obviously untrue. A third myth is that abolishing police wouldn't lead to lawlessness. As a police officer, he saw firsthand Seattle's experiment with a Capitol Hill autonomous zone known as Chaz. Police weren't allowed in the occupied protest zone for weeks. They saw the lawlessness that broke out when police could not be on patrol. A final myth is that the police are militarized. As a former soldier, he knows what it was like to ride in an armored vehicle. Today, SWAT team members use armored vehicles and armored clothing in order to avoid using deadly force, not commit it. I agree with this police officer's conclusion that the defund the police arguments are either wildly exaggerated or just plain false. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with Ryan Casey Waller. The book is entitled Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. It is a paperback book, but you can also get it in paperback or Kindle. May be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's just coming out, but also it is published by Nelson, and we have information about that on our website and more information about him as well. A licensed psychotherapist, lawyer, pastor, individual that has really brought a lot to the table. And let me focus on that for just a minute, Ryan, because I want to talk about what mental health is, but maybe as a counterpoint, anybody that has looked at your academic credentials, you collect degrees like a few other friends of mine or family members, you have a lot. So people would say you are an overachiever for sure. And yet the particular loop that runs through your brain, especially when depression is hitting you, is I'm a failure, I'm no good, I'm an embarrassment to my kids, my wife wished she was married to somebody else. And so even in the midst of the factual basis of your accomplishments, and you are a very accomplished individual, what your brain is telling you is just the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I appreciate those kind words. But yes, depression is a liar. And what depression will often do is disregard all facts. And so depression will tell you whatever it needs to tell you to make you feel worse. And the reality is that nobody is immune from mental health conditions or mental illness, and we use those terms interchangeably. Maybe we can nuance that a bit here in a moment. But the reality is, you can look at someone, just like you said, and say, hey, look, man, it looks like you've been able to do quite a bit in your life. Things are relatively good, and yet you've got these moments in which the narrative that's going on in your head is telling you that you're nothing but a failure, right? And that you're awful. And what people often don't understand is that's how this disease works. And it's difficult if you've never experienced it, because we can also look at someone and say, just to use me as an example, someone might say, what is it that you're upset about, right? You've got a wife that loves you. You've got healthy, beautiful children. You're gainfully employed. You've had advantages that other people haven't had. Why are you so sad? And what we have to understand is that it's not just sadness. Everybody has sadness, what we call reactive sadness. That's what, life is nothing but ups and downs. To feel sad is to feel normal. It's when these toxic thought patterns begin to take over in our brain that are feeding us information that do not reflect reality that depression begins to set in. And that can happen to anyone. Now, by and large, the way that we approach mental health these days is through the medical model, which is to say that we treat depression, anxiety, and other mental illness as diseases. Now, to a certain extent, that's true. There's a biological nature often to mental illness, but not always. Now, what we normally do these days is when we look at someone who's struggling with depression or anxiety, we say, to what degree is this biological? So in other words, to what degree does it appear that this person might have some inheritable traits? So for instance, depression runs in my family. I haven't suffered any real major traumas. So we would probably say, okay, in my case, there's at least some of my depression that was simply inherited. This was something that I was going to deal with in the same way that somebody might inherit a proclivity toward heart disease or cancer. But the other side of it is we say, okay, well, what aspect of this is psychological, right? So what aspect of this is just me not taking care of myself, me not engaging in psychological treatment, me not negating toxic thought patterns and challenging them as irrational. So we want to look at it and we want to consider how much of it is biological and how much of it is psychological. And so for me, I think there's a strong degree of biology that runs in mine, but then also sort of to your point, I've tried to do a lot in my life, and at many times I've done that at the risk of sort of allowing my own mental health to suffer because I'm sort of a doer, go, and was more and have oftentimes been more interested in kind of achieving the next thing versus always taking care of myself and checking in with how I was treating myself while I was going about doing things.
Talk about, if you will, maybe the plumb line or the ruler or the standard for what mental health is, because once you describe that, I think sometimes people go, I guess I'm not as mentally healthy as I thought I was, because this is what a mentally healthy person says and does and thinks. Can you help us with that?
Absolutely. So think of it this simple way. I want people to think of mental health as the foundation of their overall health. So it's not something separate, right? To be healthy, mental health is going to be a part of that health. Nobody gets to decide whether they have mental health or they don't have mental health. You have mental health. And mental health simply is the way that your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors affect your life, okay? So mental health is the way your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors affect your life. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to picture your mental health as a continuum. And on one far end, there's what we would call mentally healthy. And at the other end of the continuum, there's mental illness. And the reality is that this is not static. For people, we slide on this continuum throughout our life in the same way that nobody at any one point can say, I am fully healthy in this moment. You can look at it and say, well, I'm more on the healthier side than on the illness side. Or someone might say, well, I've got stage 3 cancer. I'm really, really suffering. I'm more toward the illness side. So what we want is to understand that when you're mentally healthy, the way that your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors are going to affect your life, they're going to allow you to do certain things. So the way that we really look at this is we say, look, if you're in good mental health, you're going to have a positive self-image of yourself, which is to say you're going to have a realistic understanding of yourself. You are going to be able to make good decisions. You are going to be able to engage in healthy interpersonal relationships. You are going to be in a place in which you can deal with life's obstacles, that resiliency that we were talking about. But when a person's thoughts, feelings and behaviors begin to affect their life in a negative way, which in other words, these thoughts begin to not reflect reality, right? They're telling you you're a terrible person. You wake up every single day and you're feeling hopeless, or you're engaging in destructive patterns of behavior. Those are symptoms that perhaps we're tilting toward mental illness. And what's important to understand about that is that's how we diagnose mental illness. Unfortunately, and this is why also the medical model of mental illness is too reductionistic.
Yes.
Is the reality is we cannot, I can't draw your blood and say, oh, okay, I'm positive for depression. I can't do a genetic screening and say, oh, yes, definitely PTSD. So we have to be, the way that it gets diagnosed is that we cluster symptoms together. So we look at certain things, and if it kind of adds up, right, okay, well, you've been feeling, hopeless, and you've been fatigued, and your appetite has plummeted to a certain degree, and this has lasted for 2 weeks, okay, then that's how we sort of get the diagnosis. But the reality is these diagnoses, while oftentimes they're necessary, so for instance, with cases of severe mental illness, say schizophrenia, where a person is legitimately having delusions of reference. So every TV show they watch, every sign they see on the road, they think somehow is involved in a conspiracy, about their own life. That's a real phenomenon that's happening. And that's where a diagnosis, can be really helpful. But for most people, especially for sort of run-of-the-mill depression and anxiety, this medical model is simply too reductionistic, because we can say, okay, well, maybe there's something biological here, and we want to treat it maybe with medication and some therapy. There are much deeper questions, in my perspective, that need to be asked. We need to look at the totality of the human experience. So I want to know what's going on with your relationships. I want to know what's happening in your faith life. I want to know what's happening with you emotionally. I want to know how you're treating your body. So we have to look at this, right, in a much bigger way than we often have in the past. So if you can take anything away from that, I would say view mental health as this continuum in which we slide back and forth. Because this is a big part of why I want to destigmatize mental illness. It's so often been talked about in the past, and people have been reticent to talk about it because they feel like if they raise their hand and they say, oh, yes, I battle depression or I battle anxiety, there's going to be a label that's placed upon them that says, okay, you are mentally ill. There's something wrong with you, right? We want to sort of separate you, from society. And what I'm here to say is no. While it might be the case that particular diagnoses are chronic, lifelong conditions, it is not the case that if you experience a depressive episode or you have a manic episode, that means that you are fundamentally going to be in those states for the rest of your life. There's great healing that can occur. I mean, what we know from the research is that upwards of 80% of people who seek treatment for depression experience a significant reduction in symptoms.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Ryan Casey Waller as we talk about his new book, Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. I might mention that we have a link to his website. It's ryancaseywaller.com. If you'd like to follow him there, maybe follow and see his blog, see his other books, and interact with him. He, I'm sure, would be glad to interact with you. We have information about this book at about 230 pages, published by Nelson Books. You can find it in your local bookstore, perhaps, but we have an opportunity there for you to get it both in paperback and Kindle. And Ryan, let's, if we can, put your pastor's hat on for just a minute, because one of your chapters asks a very good question. Why does God allow mental illness? And maybe a subcategory of that, which will get us into the conversation in just a minute in terms of suicide. Why doesn't God at least protect Christians? In other words, after I become a Christian, why can't that be a way to make sure that I won't be struggling with some of these issues of mental illness? Can you give us some insight there?
For sure. Yeah, it's a question that I know is on the mind of a lot of believers, because in the days, this book was published a week ago tomorrow. And Kerby, I can't tell you how many messages I've already gotten from people who have said that they've struggled with some kind of mental illness their entire life, but because they grew up in a Christian home, they felt as though they couldn't bring this to light or speak about it because on some level they felt as though this was a failing of their own faith. So in other words, the thinking was, well, look, if I have faith in God and if I trust in God, who brings a peace which passes all understanding, the God who calls himself the Prince of Peace, well, then there just simply must be something wrong with me because surely God wouldn't allow this if only my faith were proper, if I were pious enough, or if I believed enough. And the reality is it just breaks my heart because it's simply not so. Now, why does God allow mental illness? To me, that question is answered in the very similar way that we answer, why does God allow suffering? It seems to be God is in love with freedom, and God gave us our freedom. And in that, right, there are all kinds of things that have gone wrong and will continue to go wrong in this world. And mental illness is simply one of those gnarly waves of suffering that we have to ride in this life. What I want people to know, though, is that mental illness is not a punishment for sin. Now, that is not to say that there can't be instances in our life in which we are sinning and that exasperates some kind of mental distress that we have going on. But so often people are told, well, look, it's kind of like the friends of Job. And he says, look, my life is falling apart. I'm struggling here. And they say to him, well, there must be something that you've done, Job, that has made God upset, or there must be some unconfessed sin in your life, Job. If you'll just bring it to the light, then God will remove it. Not always the case. The other thing that Christians are often told is that, well, maybe we have this sort of thing so we can remain humble. So maybe your mental illness is your cross to bear, or as Paul said, he had a thorn that was placed in his side to keep him from becoming too haughty because of what he experienced with God. I would say no. Mental illness, while I can, trust me, when I get to heaven and can look God in the face, I will ask God, why this kind of suffering? Because those of us who have battled depression and anxiety will be the first to say, I wouldn't wish this kind of suffering upon my worst enemy. It is so isolating. It can be so devastating. It can produce such a state of despair that I wouldn't want it upon anyone. So why does God allow it? I can't speak for God other than that it falls in the same category as all human suffering. And that's what I want people to know, because what I think is particularly devastating is that when Christians believe that it's a different form of suffering, it's a specialized kind of suffering that is meant for people who don't have enough faith in God, and so thus they've got to kind of work this out on their own, before they can bring themselves to God. And I would say, no. Mental illness is here. And if we believe that our God is the God who is the ultimate healer, and if we can bring every kind of pain and every kind of ailment to the church, to God who heals in the church, then this needs to be able to be brought into it as well. Mental illness cannot be the one hurt that we don't speak about. We have to trust that God heals and that God has given us the resources for all healing. And so I always tell people too, like, look, pray about your mental health. Pray about your mental illness. Bring it to a pastor if you feel like that's going to be a safe place. Ask people to pray for you. Talk about it in your community groups. But by all means, avail yourselves to the resources that God has allowed us to create. Therapy, medication, recovery groups. Pray, but also do the things. I always tell people, prayer is not necessarily a strategy or a plan for healing. Pray about it, but then also do the things.
Yes. Let's, if we can, maybe talk about one of the biggest gut punches in your book, because you talk about Jared Wilson, a prominent pastor, who actually on Twitter said, loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure depression. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure PTSD. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure anxiety. But that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't offer us companionship and comfort. He always does that. And so then you go on to tell the story of how he was officiating a funeral for a Jesus-loving woman who took her own life, and by all accounts he did that with grace and professionalism. Then the next paragraph. Then that night, on the eve of the World Suicide Prevention Day, Jared committed suicide, killed himself. And you tell the story of actually, because you were so motivated by his previous statements, to have actually posted a very good post about how we really need to focus on this during World Suicide Prevention Day. And then you scroll down after posting it and then find out from a friend that he had taken his own life. And I think, if nothing else, Ryan, it shows you're just not exempt. It doesn't matter if you're a pastor, doesn't matter if you're a counselor, doesn't matter if you're a lawyer, doesn't matter if you're a talk show host, whatever it might be. There can be a real threat of suicide or depression or anxiety, because we're all human and we're all, to use the phrase from one of your earlier books, broken.
That's right. That's right, Kerby. Yeah, Jared's death was such a punch in the gut, I think, for a lot of us, because we look to him as, he's a great man of faith, a great Christian leader, and someone who had been brave enough to talk about his own struggles with depression. And, his death was so shocking because, as you just say, it happened right there on the eve of World Suicide Day. He had just performed, a funeral, and I had only tangentially known Jared through the internet. He had encouraged me, but a lot of guys and girls that I know and love knew him personally, and were just so gutted by his death, because it was a reminder of exactly what you say. And this is what I think, Jared would want us to take from it, is that we aren't exempt. And it doesn't really matter who you are or what level you achieve in this life, or even the robust nature of your faith. It can come for you. And if it does, it has to be taken seriously. Jared's such a good example, because here's a guy who by all means was doing all the things and serving God faithfully, and he had this disease. And I often tell people, our language about this really matters. It sometimes can be so confusing when we see particularly a faith leader die by suicide. We think, well, how could they have done that? Don't they know that that's so selfish? Or don't they know that there are so many people, who look to them as a spiritual guide? What's going to happen to those people, when their mentor, their faith leader is taken away in such a tragic way? And what we have to understand is, look, there was an aspect to this that wasn't fully vocational. So I tell people, look, oftentimes, instead of saying, he committed suicide, we want to say died by suicide. He died, from depression. People can get into such a state with this disease where they're not thinking clearly. they are so overwhelmed in pain.
Very sad.
That,
yeah.
Yes, it's very sad that suicide is not always about ending life. It's more about ending pain.
Yes.
They can think, I tell people that oftentimes with those who are suicidal at first becomes an option. It enters into their mind. And then as the pain gets worse, it becomes a better option. And then as the pain grows so intense, it becomes the only option.
Yeah. We need to take a break, and I want to come back and, if we can, talk about how people can use this book, because you have, of course, not only given us lots of great information, but you're a fellow traveler, a co-sufferer, and I would love to talk a little bit about how to take this book, Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Talk About, and use it in your own ministry or in your church. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Ryan Casey Waller as we talk about his book, Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. Ryan, I know you wrote this book to really help individuals, and you take people through not only your own experience, but give us quite a bit of understanding of mental health, suicide, the whole issue of talk therapy, medication, then a whole section in the back on suggested reading and even common signs of suicidal thoughts. thoughts and so many other issues to address. But I guess the question I would want to ask for you to maybe address for a few minutes would be how people can use this, because we have, first of all, pastors that listen to this program. And it seems to me that as a pastor, I suspect maybe you address some of these issues from the pulpit or would encourage pastors to do so. Many of us find ourselves in teaching roles. Maybe we have a life group. Maybe we have a Bible fellowship. Maybe we have a small group or something like that that could be where you could go through this but together. And of course, individuals no doubt will benefit by going through this individually, but it does bring us back to how people can take this book and use it, because the subtitle of your book is oftentimes we don't want to talk about it. So the first thing is to start talking about these issues, isn't it?
That's right. Talking about it can go a long way. Research shows that when people begin to experience a mental health condition, the first two people that they will go to are their primary care provider and their pastor. So what that tells us is that pastors are an incredibly powerful position here. And oftentimes the way that people who are in churches experiencing this and feeling alone can feel far more brought in is if pastors will address simply the reality of mental illness from the pulpit. So it's not to say, pastors, you have to have all the answers. It's not to say that you've got to become an expert in this field, but including it in your illustrations by acknowledging that it exists. When you're listing off the various struggles that people go through, including things like depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, just doing that, just naming it, can be so helpful for people to feel included, so they can say, oh my goodness, what's being offered here in the healing power of Jesus Christ is not something that's not for me, that it's for me as well, because oftentimes that's what the people are thinking. And so what I would also say is the way that then you can do this is, I would say, obviously I want pastors to read this book, because what this is this is an introduction to the topic. This is a conversation starter. This is an opportunity to get some baseline knowledge on all of these topics, because I found that many times pastors and other Christians and folks who are in leadership or teaching positions within churches are weary oftentimes of bringing up this topic is because they are very, very scared that if they ask the question, are you suffering? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you struggling with depression? They're very scared that if the person says, yes, I am, then they won't know what to do next.
Yes.
And so they steer away from asking the question. So what I want to say is, A, don't be afraid to ask the question, because let me help you really quick right here on the radio. Even if it's worst case scenario and someone tells you they're considering killing themselves, here's what you can do. You can simply not run away. All you have to say is, that sounds like you're in an incredible amount of pain. I'm here for you, and I know that there are professionals who are trained to help with this sort of thing.
Yes.
I think you should contact one of them, right? You don't have to be an expert. Your friend isn't expecting you to be an expert. Your friend isn't expecting you to heal them. But what they are expecting you to do is be too afraid to ask or to run away. And if you don't do that, if you can show up in love in that moment, right, you can give them so much hope. And then all you have to do is point to the professionals. So beyond that, go in, if you read in the book, I go into some of the more specific scenarios
right.
of places you can direct people to, of questions that are good to ask, questions that you want to avoid. I really wanted to not just have some general conversations in this book, but really dive into some of those specific practical applications. As you mentioned, I do, in the book. And so, yes, I would love, promote this book, churches, to read in groups together, to use it as a place, because here's the thing, even if you're not suffering, even if you don't think you know someone that is suffering, let me tell you something, you do. Someone you know, someone you love. If the numbers are 1 in 4, those are underreported. It's probably more like 2 out of 4. And who knows, given the situation, of the past globally of what we've endured during the past year, people around you are suffering. People around you are dying to have this conversation. So especially if you're a person who's like, hey, this hasn't been one of my struggles. Maybe you're the one that recommends, hey, I heard about this book. I know this is an issue for a lot of people. Why don't we read it? You can be the one to initiate the conversation, because someone who's struggling, they might be afraid to recommend the book as something you want to read as a group, because they don't want to be outed, because they're not sure it's a safe place yet. So if this isn't your particular issue, one way you could help is by be the leader. Say, let's talk about this, because I know people need to talk about this.
Well, and again, when we are sitting here talking about what pastors can do for their congregation, let me just give you one more number out of your book. 23% of pastors say they have personally struggled with mental illness of some kind. So, and again, I know that number is underreported. I just know enough about the fact that most pastors keep the wall up pretty high. So it's quite possible that as you're sitting in a congregation, you're looking at a pastor, or maybe you're an elder or a deacon and have some connection to the pastor. Maybe you need to pass the book on for them with the idea that this would be helpful for people in your congregation, but it really is going to be helping them as well. And as having been in ministry yourself, when you were in the pulpit, some of the things that were going on in terms of your own experiences are certainly a good example. And because you've been kind of a co-sufferer and fellow traveler, this is why I think this book is so great. So, Ryan Casey Waller, it has always been great to have you on the program, talking about your other books, talking about the millennial generation, talking about trends in society, talking about ministry. But I also appreciate you writing this book. And maybe in the future, I know you're real busy right now. I know what happens when books come out. But maybe a little bit later, we can get you in the studio with maybe some other people that are counseling professionals, and we can have a roundtable discussion on this as well. But thank you, first of all, for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an entire hour here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much. I appreciate your good work, and I'll come back anytime. Anything for you, sir.
Well, we are going to take a break, but let me just mention again, the book is entitled Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. It's published by Nelson Books. Excellent, about 230 pages. We have a link to his website, ryancaseywaller.com. You can find out about other books that he has written, but also this book, which is both in paperback and Kindle, something that you would find very helpful. And really, it really tries to help you see why we need these kinds of conversations inside the church about mental health. Helps you maybe understand a little bit more about what counseling professionals are doing in that regard. And now I think he does a good job of helping us understand brain science and brain health, but also the intersection between biology and spirituality, and the whole issue of emotional intelligence that needs to be addressed. And then I love practical books, just some very good practical steps on how to, for example, find a therapist, how to distinguish between, say, a psychiatrist and a psychologist, how to even say, well, can I even afford treatment? And most importantly, be equipped to not only maybe minister to you if you have a need, but be equipped to support your loved ones, your family members, your friends, coworkers, and others to really bring them back to an issue of mental health. So again, book is entitled Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. Ryan Casey Waller's been with us, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about social media, and the purge has begun. And if you're not familiar with that, even on Friday night, we were starting to see some pretty good evidence of the fact that social media now feels like they can make a lot of decisions and have already made decisions about the president. Of course, the other day, they decided that they would temporarily suspend President Trump's Twitter account. Now they have decided to permanently ban him, as well as other individuals, which would include lawyers like Sidney Powell and National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, to mention just a few. By the way, that list is starting to grow, because I have said before that if they could go after the president, or they could go after the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, they could go after you in terms of the surveillance and investigation. But if they can actually ban those individuals, they can ban others. Kevin McCullough has been on this program. He's a talk show host, and the other day he was suspended by Twitter on Thursday. Brandon Straka, if you're familiar with him, he's actually a former Democrat who formed what was called the hashtag walkaway movement of some of the Democrats that had been leaving the Democratic Party, and they suspended his account on Facebook. So if you think this is just a few isolated incidents or just a few individuals, maybe I should make a long list and post it on Point of View, because you can see indeed what is taking place. By the way, in terms of Sidney Powell, not only has her account been suspended, but as we mentioned on Friday, Dominion Voting Systems filed a $1.3 billion defamation lawsuit against her, accusing her of actually orchestrating a conspiracy theory about the company's role in the 2020 election. As Dr. Merrill Matthews said on Friday, I says, I know Sidney Powell, and I know she doesn't have $1 billion. And of course, that's not the point. The point is to have that amount so much as to threaten anybody else that would dare even make a statement about Dominion Voting Systems, and really is kind of a shot across the bow. So the first article I've posted here reminds you of, first of all, this whole desire and the action that was taken on Twitter, but then you have some other actions being taken as well, and those are to actually try to drive Parler out of business. Those of you that have said, well, I'm going to leave Twitter and go to Parler, if you went to your app today, you noticed you can't get on. Of course, the other day, Apple said we're not even going to make the app available. And that is then where the head of Twitter later, after that was the number one app that was being selected on the App Store. And when it was removed, then he, if nothing else, mocked it by pointing out that his now app is up there, number one. But more to the point, this has been an attempt to just completely deplatform a lot of individuals, and the justification from Twitter is that the president is a risk of further incitement of violence. Now, would this have happened even without what happened last Wednesday, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes with Jim Denison? Probably. My argument has always been that social media was a little fearful of the possibility that a U.S. Senate could, in one way or another, limit them or remove Section 230 from the Communications Decency Act or something like that. But once you have the election and the confirmation of Joe Biden being the next president, once you have the House already held by the Democrats, and then the two elections in Georgia last week going to Democrats, there was little, if any, concern now that Silicon Valley would ever be limited. And so as a result, it is becoming more powerful than ever. And I think it was interesting because Jarrett Stepman, an article which I didn't post, does remind us that this whole argument about the tweets by Donald Trump being an incitement to violence kind of ring a little hollow when you realize that to this day, Twitter still has posts from the Chinese Communist Party, from Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, a socialist, and even the Ayatollah of Iran has a platform there. So you have to recognize that sometimes you have to believe that this was done and said in a way that doesn't really necessarily pass the straight face test. But it also, I think, illustrates the fact of how Silicon Valley was convinced that they would not have any difficulty under a Biden-Harris administration. And one reason for that is the evidence is now very clear that more money from big tech has gone to the Biden campaign than to any other candidate in the history of America. Now, that's a pretty strong statement, so you're probably thinking, okay, Kerby, you better back it up. Okay, here it is. If you look at the amount of donations that came even from big tech to, of course, Hillary Clinton back in 2016, that was about $163 million. Well, this time, the donations to the to the Biden-Harris campaign was $199 million. And just in case you're wondering, about $22 million went to the Trump campaign. So 10 times as much to that, and almost $200 million going to Joe Biden, and also to Kamala Harris, who has always been seen as relatively easy for the Silicon Valley moguls to have contact with and interact with. And so there's, of course, been a call for an investigation. The House Intelligence Committee ranking member, that would be Devin Nunes from California, actually the other day called for a RICO investigation into big tech. That would be the Racketeer, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. But at the same time, does anybody seriously think that that will go anywhere, either in the House of Representatives, which is still controlled by the Democrats, or in the Senate, which is essentially now controlled by the Democrats, or in the Department of Justice, which will have, of course, a different Attorney General, who is Merrick Garland, who is an individual that would be put in that position under Joe Biden. Matter of fact, he was very critical of the Department of Justice and the FBI for even being silent on the issue, even though he believes that this is a clear violation of antitrust, of civil rights, and of the RICO statute. But nevertheless, even though there was a call for this investigation, not sure it's going to go anywhere. And his argument is that it's bad enough that Twitter has decided to ban anyone they decide to do so. And it's a free company. It is a free country. It is a company that is privately held, so I guess they could theoretically do that. But then they've gone out of their way by affecting Parler. And so this has been a collusion between Apple, Amazon, Google, and others trying to destroy what could be like $1 billion company. So that's his argument. We'll see if it goes anywhere, but it's a good illustration of the attempt to begin the purge. And indeed, will that take place in the future? If indeed you can purge the President of the United States, prominent lawyers, a former national security advisor, various talk show hosts, can they purge you? Well, they probably can. And so we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that. To be fair, let me, when I come back from the break, give you at least the statement by Twitter and then the two tweets by Donald Trump that they thought were actually calling for violence. And I'll let you be the judge as to whether or not This even passes the straight face test. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The many myths surrounding the slogan, defund the police, need to be addressed. That is why I was encouraged to read a thoughtful critique from a progressive who lives in Seattle, but also works for law enforcement. Christopher Young has been a big city cop for more than a quarter century and brings some common sense to the debate about the police. The first myth he tackles is the argument that police are killing large number of civilians. Criminal justice experts I've quoted in previous commentaries have proven that's not true. He cites statistics from New York City to prove his point, but you can also use national crime statistics as well. His second myth is the naive belief that the anti-cop movement is largely peaceful. He likens the movement to Batman's villain, Two-Face. The protests in the daytime were mostly examples of lawful free speech. The dynamic changed dramatically at night as riots broke out. He reminds us that the mainstream media adopted what he called the comically false peaceful protest narrative, which was obviously untrue. A third myth is that abolishing police wouldn't lead to lawlessness. As a police officer, he saw firsthand Seattle's experiment with a Capitol Hill autonomous zone known as Chaz. Police weren't allowed in the occupied protest zone for weeks. They saw the lawlessness that broke out when police could not be on patrol. A final myth is that the police are militarized. As a former soldier, he knows what it was like to ride in an armored vehicle. Today, SWAT team members use armored vehicles and armored clothing in order to avoid using deadly force, not commit it. I agree with this police officer's conclusion that the defund the police arguments are either wildly exaggerated or just plain false. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I thought we would talk for just a few more minutes about the justification from Twitter, but let me just mention there's probably another question in your mind that I am really going to postpone till tomorrow, and that's the whole question of impeachment. Now, it's interesting, the House Majority Whip, James Clyburn, a Democrat from South Carolina, and who is, of course, the whip in the House on the Democratic side, has said that maybe they won't push the articles of impeachment too quickly, although tomorrow we'll spend more time talking about that. There was an attempt today to have that happen, but you really have to go under regular order, which will be tomorrow, in which, again, the House could maybe focus on that. There are all sorts of reasons why if you try to impeach the president between now in the next 9 days before the inauguration, it's not going to work. First of all, can you do all of it in 9 days? Probably not. Alan Dershowitz points out something kind of interesting, and that is if indeed you look at what is established by the Senate rules, which could be changed, but at the moment Senate rules require a period of time between the actual indictment and then when those articles are finally being considered. If you do a timeline, the first time the U.S. Senate could convene to actually consider an impeachment would be on the afternoon of January 20th at 1 o'clock, Well, that would be 1 hour after Donald Trump is no longer the president of the United States. So then you come back to James Clyburn's suggestion, well, maybe what we'll do is we won't even send the articles of impeachment to the Senate till after at least the first 100 days of Joe Biden's administration, because we don't want it to be a distraction from all the things we want President Biden to do. Well, then Alan Dershowitz has a good answer for that as well, and that is, if you go back and read the Constitution, I know most people don't do that, even in Congress, it talks about the fact that you can impeach a president. You can't impeach a former president, but nevertheless, who lets those kinds of things get in their way? So anyway, we'll spend more time on the impeachment question tomorrow. It's relevant, but maybe not relevant today in light of all the action. Okay, here's the argument from Twitter. I'm reading from their statement. Twitter said, after close review of recent tweets from @RealDonaldTrump account and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter, we have permanently suspended the account due to the risk of further incitement of violence. So again, the president is inciting violence. I think it's fair to point out that if you want to go back and look at the speech by the president on Wednesday, and some talk show hosts have pointed out, isn't it interesting? You haven't heard any clips from that speech. I'm sure it's available, but you're not really finding that incitement to violence. But nevertheless, Twitter doesn't use that as their justification for dropping @RealDonaldTrump. They use two tweets. Okay, one came out January 8th. I'll read it. It's in entirety. Donald Trump said, "The 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America First and Make America Great Again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form." Where's the threat there? Oh, well, again, if you are recognizing that words can be seen as threats, the word patriot is enough, apparently, for Twitter. American patriots is meant to support violent acts, which, again, doesn't exactly pass any sense of common sense, that they would have a giant voice and not be disrespected, which shows that he's not going to facilitate an orderly transition. And so, you can try to read through this, but again, I think most people reading that would say this is just an encouragement to his supporters. If there's a threat there, unless you've been reading The Coddling of the American Mind, the interview we did with Jonathan Haidt, you really can't find anything here that would be that scary, but that is one of them. Then the other tweet that they cite is one that came out just the other day, in which, again, @RealDonaldTrump, he said, "To all those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Well, again, the argument is that if he's not going to go on January 20th, he's signaling to all these violent people that they have all the freedom in the world to go after what happens on the inauguration. And again, it's just really kind of hard to figure out how any of this could even be used as a justification for taking the Donald Trump tweet off. But as I've said before, take his Twitter account away. Matter of fact, he started then trying to communicate under the official presidential, the POTUS tweet, and that didn't go anywhere, the Twitter account. So there we are. One of the things Kelly Shackelford pointed to was a piece that appeared in Politico talking about how Republicans may actually make this whole issue of Twitter a campaign issue. You think? This is written by David Siders, in which he, first of all, has a quote from James Dickey, who actually has been on the program with us. He is the former chair of the Texas Republican Party. The current chair of the Texas Republican Party is Colonel Allen West, by the way. But James Dickey the other day said that this level of censorship would make China proud. And he said maybe it's a wake-up call for Americans. And James Dickey predicted that Republicans will campaign on the unrestrained power of social media and other technology firms in the midterms. And so we'll see where that begins to unfold, because this article goes into some detail about that. Later in the article, interestingly enough, they quote from David Rubin, who is a liberal, a self-avowed liberal, who's kind of changed his mind a little bit about some of the people on the left. And he's a talk show host and said, this is the battle of our time. This is a war on reality. We're in an information war. And he says, regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, the fact that big tech oligarchs can decide who can speak, everyone should be absolutely outraged right now. Now, I saw a post the other day, which I passed on to some, in which people say, well, when you're on the right side of history, you don't have to worry about big tech actually censoring you. Oh, yes, you do. Sooner or later, you're going to find yourself a foul. Look at all the liberals who have now been facing the cancel culture from a very radical left. But they don't seem to understand that. Unless you think this is happening just in Twitter and on Facebook, and it's just happening maybe in Instagram a little bit and a few others. And certainly these are ones that we should watch in terms of social media. It also looks like it's happening in the publishing world, and we mentioned this the other day, because if indeed you have Senator Josh Hawley, who is a Republican from Missouri and a senator, he probably will be a presidential candidate, although after he's participated in some of these challenges, we'll see. But he had a book coming out called The Tyranny of Big Tech. Well, the publishing house of Simon & Schuster announced that it was canceling the book. And again, the argument that they used is because of the riot or the storming of the Capitol. I think they were maybe ready to do so anyway, but they describe Hawley's role in what has become a dangerous threat to our democracy and freedom. And, of course, you have not only seen the impact that it's had on him, but I've been kind of making a list here of all the individuals who attended that rally on the eclipse, who maybe didn't even make it to the Capitol, but nevertheless found themselves in very difficult situations. For those of you in Pennsylvania, you probably heard this story of one of the public school teachers in Allentown, Pennsylvania, who was actually relieved of his duties. And the argument from the superintendent was, quote, because of the emotion and controversy stirred by the events of January 6th, the teacher has been temporarily relieved of his teaching duties until the school district can complete a formal investigation of his involvement. Of course, the list is getting much longer of those individuals, if they were even in Washington, D.C., even if they never made their way down to the Capitol, even if they weren't involved in anything illegal, that was enough for them to find themselves being censured as well. And so just before we take a break, let me mention one of the articles that we've also posted is by Katie Pavlich, who once again reminds us of how horrific the scenes were on the Capitol. We'll be talking about that in just a minute with Jim Denison, but then goes on to remind us of how there was such a blind eye that was not given to all the other things. As she points out, you even have the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris helping to fundraise to get rioters out of jail after the rioters attempted to storm the White House, burn a historic church, injured more than 60 different Secret Service individuals, and, of course, have defaced various government buildings, not necessarily the Capitol, but other ones. And it's just a reminder, again, of some of the hypocrisy taking place. But let's take a break. When we come back, Jim Denison with us. He is the head of the Denison Forum. He's written quite a number of pieces trying to make sense of all the chaos, trying to think about how we as Christians should respond to some of the very legitimate questions we've raised on this program in the past. But most importantly, what is now transpiring in terms of what many people call the Big Purge. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, and we are privileged to bring back to the microphone Dr. Jim Denison. He's been with us more recently, but especially in light of all the things that transpired last week. We've been talking about the purge, and of course, part of the justification for that is what happened at the Capitol. And if you go to the daily article by Dr. Jim Denison, you know that certainly on January 7th, he talked about the sickening and heartbreaking sight and 4 biblical responses to the Capitol assault. Then on the 8th, after the Capitol riots, 3 questions everyone is asking and a biblical path to empowering purpose. The one coming out today was the Capitol riot, a Christian insurrection, why we must live as though the truth were true. So these are 3 different daily articles by Dr. Jim Denison, who again is with the Denison Forum and joins us now by phone. So Jim, your thoughts about what transpired last Wednesday?
Well, Kerby, thank you. Glad to be on with you again today, my friend. Your ministry could not be more timely than it is right now. So I was in my office last Wednesday. I got a notification on Twitter, actually, that this was beginning to happen at D.C., that this mass rally was turning violent. I turned on the television, and I watched something I never imagined I would see. Kerby, you and I both have traveled the world. I mean, I've been to Tiananmen Square. I've been to Tahrir Square in Cairo. I saw a riot outside my hotel room in Athens. I have been to the Temple Mount any number of times. But I never dreamed that the kind of political violence we see overseas, we would see here. It was absolutely heartbreaking just to watch, wasn't it?
Well, and again, we were doing a live broadcast, and I, in the midst of it, did my best to try to cover some of that, maybe made a mistake or a misstep here or there. And I guess as we work our way through it, let's recognize that there are a very high percentage of voters that aren't so sure that this election has been on the up and up. So we can understand why there was certainly a concern and why the rally that took place in the eclipse should be separated from the people that were there on the Capitol, and why I think we've also been talking about the fact that even Jonathan Turley, a longtime Democrat but also professor of law at George Washington University, says, we really do need to have an investigation, a no-holds-barred investigation, a real commission, because there are so many individuals, if you believe the Rasmussen report, 47% of voters that really have some questions about the election. But at the same time, you're raising a good question. Is this the way Jesus or Christians would respond when they have very serious concerns about some of the election irregularities? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. As you're saying so well, Kerby, we've had these issues for years in this country. I think that should be a nonpartisan issue, shouldn't it, to be discussing the fact that we want absolute voter security. You go back to 2000, and only 16% of Democrats believed that George W. Bush fairly won the election. In 2016, I believe it was 67% of Democrats thought that Russians colluded with President Trump's campaign. And, of course, now 66% of Republicans believe that the election was on some level stolen or rigged. And so we really want to be at a place where we can trust our elections, because that's critical to trusting our democracy. But on the other side of that, as followers of Jesus, it's not just that we want to demand truth. We want to do so in the truthful way. We want to speak the truth in love. We want to act in ways that draw people not just to the truth, but to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. We want to be wise as serpents, discerning, and harmless as doves, and we want to be discerning in these moments in a way that draw people to our Lord, because He ultimately is the only answer to every issue that we face.
We really are dealing with a broken culture, and you talk about that. And, of course, we talk about how we can turn that around. You even have a quote from Chuck Colson, people who cannot restrain their own baser instincts, who cannot treat one another with civility, are not capable of self-government. And we've seen this on both sides. Matter of fact, one of the articles that I've posted here reminds us that up until recently, there were a lot of people that weren't all that concerned, seemingly, about some of the violence that was taking place in our cities, and now are reacting, I think legitimately so. It's wrong whether you are wearing a Black Lives Matter label, or you're supporting the police, or whether you're supporting Donald Trump, or whether you're supporting Joe Biden. You touch a police officer, you go to jail. You break something, you go to jail. You trespass, you go to jail. But at the same time, it does seem to me that as Christians, hopefully we can be set apart and maybe begin to think about what you call some of these imperatives, because if we want to change a broken culture, we have to recognize sometimes we're broken ourselves, aren't we?
We do, don't we? We can't lead people further than we're willing to go. We can't give what we don't have. So this is an opportunity to be reframed. It's an opportunity to be redeemed. The darker the room, the more obvious the light, as we sometimes say. So let's look at the brokenness of our culture as an opportunity for the gospel, as an opportunity for us to behave, for instance, with civility when others are not, and especially when they're incivil toward us, as an opportunity to love people who don't love us. In fact, to pray for those who persecute us, as Jesus said, as an opportunity to be so different that people will see our difference and wonder why we are different. Kerby, I can tell you, I was led to faith in Christ by Christians, by the fact that Jesus made a difference in their lives. And my question from my Sunday school teacher back in 1973, when I prayed a salvation prayer, was, how can I have what you have? It wasn't, how can I be saved? How can I be sanctified? How can I be regenerated? I didn't know any of that. I just knew that these Christians had a joy and a peace and a love for each other that I had never seen before, and I wanted what they had. Well, that's our opportunity in these very difficult days.
Let's talk about what this means going forward. The other day Rand Paul said that the assault or the storming of the Capitol set us back a generation. I was thinking, I hope not. But he was thinking politically. You and I are looking at it just for a moment and what it does in terms of evangelicals, because I just before you came on talked about how what took place last Wednesday is being used as a justification for social media to close down Twitter accounts, to try to drive Parler out of business, and all sorts of other things that will be taking place, and to rescind publishing contracts for books and all sorts of other things. But something else, and that is the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Religion News Service, you have some quotes in today's issue, are all blaming evangelicals. So it's almost a given that once Donald Trump is off the scene, one way or the other, they're going to be looking for their next boogeyman, and I think evangelicals are going to be the boogeyman. And in some respects, because you had people at this particular riot, I will call it that, or what they call an insurrection, who have Jesus Saves banners and people carrying things that say, Jesus, my Savior, Trump is my president, it becomes very easy to paint, which the media tends to do too often, with a really broad brush to blame all Christians for what took place last Wednesday. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we ought not be surprised. You're exactly right. That's already happening. And it's really three steps. The first step is to say that evangelicals elected Trump, which is not by any means entirely true, but that's nonetheless the claim. Then second is say Trump caused the riots, which again is a subject for a completely different conversation, the degree to which that's true. And so therefore evangelicals are responsible for the riot. Well, the people that are making those claims, as I'm reading the news,
Guess I lost Denison, but I think the point he was making there is, as you're reading some of the articles that appeared, and again, you can go in this daily article and find a headline from the Washington Post. He has a link to the Atlantic and also to the Religion News Service. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is it's just one of those issues that we have been trying to focus on. And I have, from some time, convinced that sometimes there are situations in which, indeed, we're looking for the next person to write about in an appeal letter, if you're a liberal or if you're a secularist, and to actually go and blame Christians for it. That happened under Nero, didn't it? The floods and the fires, it's all due to the Christians, right?
That's been the case for a very long time, hasn't it? It's always easy to blame the person that you're not for that which you wish to see happen as the result. And years ago, Kerby, someone taught me the three ways to get elected or to raise funds or to do anything else you want done. First of all, convince people they have an enemy. Second, convince them they can't defeat their enemy. Third, convince them you will defeat their enemy if they'll vote for you or give you money or whatever it is you want. And so now we're seeing a demonization of that which is considered to be responsible for those riots. To the degree that's true or not is completely different subject or related subject, but nonetheless, that's what we're experiencing and should expect to experience. So let's look at this the way that Chinese Christians look at this, and the way Cuban Christians look at this, and the way Christians in parts of the Middle East look at this, as an opportunity to pray for those that persecute us, as an opportunity to love those that hurt us, as an opportunity to show people the difference Jesus makes in our lives and the difference Jesus can make in their lives.
Dr. Jim Denison with us. Let's take a break, but let's open up the phones. Maybe you have some thoughts about this. 1-800-351-1212. We are starting to see some trends and looking ahead, and one of those, of course, is the, if you will, the purge, which I suspected might have happened even without what happened last Wednesday, but this provides another very convenient excuse. And I've said from some time that if Donald Trump comes off the scene, the other side's going to have to find somebody, and oftentimes they're looking for people to blame. And if you look at some of the headlines, well, it's you evangelical Christians, all of us evangelical Christians that's to blame. What are your thoughts? 1-800-351-1212. Have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Jim Denison. Again, if you want to know more about the Denison Forum, we are quoting from a number of the daily articles. And, Jim, I might come back to January 8th because, first of all, I love the research that you do. I sometimes say you're researchers, but I know you and I pretty much do the research ourselves. But you reminded us of back in 2000, only 18% of Democrats said that George W. Bush won fairly. I'd kind of forgotten how low that number is, but that makes some sense because we're talking about the fact that there were 537 votes, difference in Florida. And so I could understand that. But here's the interesting thing. In 2016, you have 2/3, 67% of Democrats believe that Russia hacked the election when there wasn't any evidence of that, and that was a myth that was spread, yet we had a whole investigation on it to pretty much set that aside. But this time, you talk about the fact that you have that same percentage, about 67% of Republicans that believe the election was rigged. Well, I can go you one better, because I've been looking at some of the polls. If you take the Rasmussen poll, that's 75% of Republicans. And you say, oh, yeah, but we've had Rasmussen on this program, and he's, right of center. Okay, let's take the left of center pollsters. That would be Quinnipiac and Reuters. And they still say about half of the Republicans believe there was massive fraud. But here's the other point. Reuters also argues that 16% of Democrats and 33% of independents also believe that fraud swayed the election. Quinnipiac had a sizable percentage of all registered voters, 34%. So there is a difference, and that is this time there is not just a partisan reaction as there was 4 years ago, and some Democrats, I think, wrongly believe that Russia hacked the election. You have a fairly sizable number, not only of Republicans, but a good number of independents, at least a third, and even a good number of Democrats. The lowest number you come up with is 16%. I've seen some that are higher. And so this would suggest that if we did have an investigation of Russia hacking 4 years ago, then what the law professor for George Washington University, Jonathan Turley, I got to love him because he's a Democrat, he's really pretty much of a liberal, but he's really honest with the facts, say we really do need a commission, because even if you're Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you've got to lead the American people, and there are just a lot of questions that we've tried to surface, even on this program, that just seem questionable. And it seems to me that the way out of this is not only to pray about this and to pray for incoming leaders and to pray for our current president, but pray for our future president, and really exercise civility, but really try to get to the bottom of this instead of having the media, which steadfastly either ignores it or dismisses it, it's baseless, or there's no evidence, or even ridicules this because it's not healthy for the future of the country. What are your thoughts?
Well, I absolutely agree, Kerby, completely. We're a democracy that depends on the integrity of our elections, so we can trust the integrity of those that are elected. I would think this should absolutely be a nonpartisan issue. In fact, I would think that periodically, given the changes in technology, the threats from abroad, the changes within state governments in terms of mail-in ballots and how those are going to be handled, that some kind of a nonpartisan process to ensure the integrity of our elections is absolutely vital, both for the winners and the losers. If I were elected president, I would want the people of America to believe I was elected appropriately and fairly so that I could govern more effectively. And so it's really on both sides. Christians are truth tellers. We believe in the truth. We believe that the truth sets you free as followers of Jesus. We believe in the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. So we want to be advocates for truth and ultimately for the Christ who is the Lord of truth.
Let's, if we can, take some phone calls. And if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Arizona first. Dave, thank you for calling today. Dave, are you there?
Sure, I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead for it.
My question is, the felony murder doctrine could be applied to all who took part in the invasion of and destruction and attack at the Capitol. Over 900 law enforcement officers, public officials were victims at Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2020. The federal murder doctrine, the law and the statutes that said any death which occurs during the commission of a felony is first-degree murder, and all participants of the felony or attempted felony can be charged with and found guilty of murder.
Okay, well, just real quickly, first of all, we have seen the arrest of a number of those individuals, the ones that were in the Speaker of the House office and some of those others. Now, again, there have been some deaths, and there have been some questions as to whether or not that one individual died because he was hit on the head with a fire extinguisher, but some people aren't so sure about that, and some of those others. But, those are going to be matters for the courts to consider. But so far, as I've said before, You touch a police officer, you go to jail. You break a window, you go to jail. And they're starting to, because they are able to identify many of these individuals, incarcerate them. And I think that's the right action, don't you think, Jim?
Absolutely do. We are people as believers who believe in law and order. We believe according to Romans 13 in supporting those that are in power and in authority. We believe according to 1 Timothy 2 in praying for our authorities. I love Justin the Martyr statement early in Christian history that Christians make the best citizens. We certainly ought to be people who are supporting the law, living according to the law, and acting according to the law. That most honors Jesus. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter struck off the ear of the high priest's servant, and Jesus healed that ear, told Peter to put his sword back, and refused to participate in an illegal armed insurrection, even though that which he was being subjected to was in so many ways illegal. And so we certainly want to be advocates of law and order as a means of leading people to the one who we serve as the God of all law and order.
And you can find some of that information in today's daily article. We'll mention that in just a minute. Let me take one more phone call before we talk about some of the resources available there at the Denison Forum. So we'll head to Rhode Island and let's see if we can, New Hampshire, excuse me. And that is, we'll go to Rob. Rob, thank you for joining us today here.
Yeah, thanks for the call, taking my call. So you might have answered this a little bit in the last caller, but I hear a lot of message and sermon about the love and peace approach and reconciling with those who are at odds with us. But there's also, it almost seems like an afterthought, the concept of standing for the truth. So I'd like to hear your view on how those two philosophies meld together out there in a culture that's increasingly hostile to the Christian message.
Yes. We only got about a minute, but a very quick answer from you, Jim Denison, and maybe I'll try to cover some more of that tomorrow.
Ephesians 4:15, we are to speak the truth in love. And it is both, exactly as Rob says. We're people of truth, but we speak that truth in the spirit of grace, as beggars helping beggars find bread, as people that are sharing with others what's been given to us, as we serve Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. As we're truth tellers in love, we'll make the difference that will honor him.
I might just mention that we have a link to the Denison Forum. Of course, there's Denison Ministries, and if people would like to read today's daily article or the previous two, which all sort of focus on some of that, they can find that at the denisonforum.org, can't they?
They can. Thank you for that opportunity to say that. That's where we'll see the daily article, the podcast, a lot of the radio work that we do, the books that we write, all the other materials are available there. We're a donor-based ministry, so we can give all our digital resources away. We have about 2 million people in our audience now, and are honored to share this with them and with you today, my friend.
Well, wish we had a little more time, but I wanted to slip you in just so that people could hear from you and read you in more detail. Let me just, as a program note, mention tomorrow we'll get into the whole question of impeachment. I did mention that briefly, but that may be an action that will take place on Tuesday, so we'll postpone that till tomorrow. Also, we'll have Daryl Strawberry on tomorrow. He probably has a few comments to say about all of this as well, since he, of course, has interacted with the president and others. So we've got a lot to cover, and it's going to be a busy week. So I hope you'll join us every day here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View.